The memo didn't come with a press conference. There was no celebration, no trophy, no moment where the commissioner walked to a podium and declared victory. It arrived the way most seismic shifts in professional sports do, quietly, through a union notification, buried inside the language of labor negotiations that most fans would never bother to read. But inside that memo was a number. And that number, $8 million, meant something no one in the history of this league had ever been able to say before. For 28 years, the WNBA had been operating under a simple and stubborn financial reality. The league spent more than it earned. Season after season, owners absorbed losses. Players accepted salaries that required overseas contracts just to make ends meet. The business model was sustained by belief in growth, belief in potential, belief that someday the numbers would turn. And every year they mostly didn't. Then 2024 happened. And now, for the first time since the league played its first game in 1997, the WNBA generated enough revenue to trigger a player revenue sharing clause that had been sitting dormant inside a collective bargaining agreement. Written in, agreed to, and never once activated. Not in the late 90s boom. Not in the 2000s. Not after any of the championships, the rivalries, the iconic moments, or the cultural movements that made this league matter to millions of people. Not once. Not ever. Until now. This isn't a story about $8 million. $8 million divided across 13 teams, split among full rosters, doesn't change anyone's life in a transformative way. This is a story about what that number proves, and what it demands. It's a story about a league that spent 3 decades asking its players for patience and finally, in a single extraordinary season, handed them proof that the promise was real. It's a story about leverage, labor, and what happens when the financial reality of a professional sports league shifts almost overnight and the people who built it, brick by brick, year after year, refuse to be left on the outside of the windfall they helped create. But it's also a story about an uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all of the celebration. A truth about who specifically triggered this moment, how quickly it happened, and why the timing of this announcement is either the most remarkable coincidence in league history or the most honest thing the WNBA has ever accidentally admitted to the public. The threshold was crossed in 2024. Caitlin Clark entered the league in 2024. Make of that what you will. But before you decide what it means, understand what it actually took to get here, and why the story underneath the headline is more complicated, more consequential, and more revealing about the true state of women's professional basketball than any single number can capture. Understand why it matters far more than the dollar amount suggests. Understand what the players intend to do with this new weapon in the most consequential contract negotiation women's professional basketball has ever seen. Because what's coming next is not a celebration. It's a reckoning. And it started with a quiet memo that most people completely ignored. This is that story. Before this story goes where it needs to go, you need to understand 3 things that most of the coverage around this moment completely missed. 3 questions that sound simple on the surface but get significantly more complicated the deeper you push into them. The first question is this: what actually was the threshold and why was it so difficult to reach for so long? The WNBA has never publicly disclosed the exact benchmark that had to be crossed before revenue sharing would activate. They haven't released their full revenue figures. They haven't opened the books in any meaningful way that would allow independent analysis. And that opacity is not accidental. It is entirely strategic. Because if you knew the exact number, you could do the math yourself. You could calculate how close the league came in previous seasons. You could determine precisely what changed in 2024 and by exactly how much. The league does not want that conversation happening publicly, especially not in the middle of active labor negotiations. So by the end of this, you'll understand what the threshold was built on, why the pandemic made it structurally almost unreachable, and what finally pushed the revenue needle past the line in a single season. The second question is harder and more revealing. Why does the timing of this announcement matter as much as it does? This disclosure is not arriving in a quiet off-season moment. It is not being shared as a soft, feel-good story about how far the league has come. It is landing directly in the middle of collective bargaining negotiations, with the 2026 season approaching and both the league and the union sitting across from each other at the table. The union has a deliberate reason for surfacing this information now. The league has a calculated reason for how it is choosing to frame it. And the players have an argument available to them today that they were completely unable to make 1 year ago. Understanding why the timing is intentional changes how you read every single thing about this announcement. The third question is the one that reframes the entire story from the ground up. Is the WNBA's financial breakthrough a sign of real structural growth? Or is it a one-player phenomenon that may not sustain itself? There is a version of this story where the league crossed the threshold because of expanded markets, improved television deals, deeper corporate investment, and years of brand building finally paying off. And there is another version where one rookie from Iowa walked into the league and single-handedly moved every metric that determines whether a revenue threshold gets cleared. Those two versions lead to very different conclusions about what the future looks like and what the players should be demanding right now. By the end of this, you will understand all three: the threshold, the timing, and the truth behind the number. You'll understand why the players are demanding something dramatically different from the current compensation structure. And you'll understand the one detail about this revenue-sharing milestone that the league hoped would get quietly buried inside the celebration. The detail that strengthens the union's position more than any other single fact in this entire negotiation. To understand why this moment carries the weight that it does, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Caitlin Clark, not the beginning of this labor dispute, but the beginning of the league itself. Because the WNBA was constructed from day one on a financial model that was structurally dependent on one essential ingredient: patience. The league launched in 1997 as a summer complement to the NBA. 8 teams, modest salaries, and a founding philosophy built on the belief that women's professional basketball would grow slowly, organically, and sustainably over time if given the institutional support it needed. The NBA subsidized the early years directly. Owners accepted annual losses as the cost of building something with long-term value. And the players, many of whom were among the most talented and decorated athletes in the world, accepted salaries that bore no reasonable relationship to the value they were generating on the floor, operating under the assumption that growth would eventually be rewarded. For years, that growth arrived in fits and starts. There were golden eras. The late 90s with Lisa Leslie commanding both the court and cultural space. Sheryl Swoopes redefining what a professional women's basketball player could look like in the American imagination. Diana Taurasi beginning a career that would ultimately make her the strongest argument anyone could construct for women's basketball being elite at the highest level. The 2000s brought the Houston Comets dynasty, the rise of Lauren Jackson, and international stars who gave the league a global identity. The 10s brought the Minnesota Lynx, arguably the most dominant dynasty in WNBA history, with Maya Moore and Simone Augustus and Sylvia Fowles building a championship culture that never quite received the national recognition it deserved. There were iconic moments that should have been national stories and barely earned a line in a sports ticker. Through all of it, the league maintained the same fundamental promise to its players: we are building something real. The financial rewards will come. The numbers will eventually reflect what you are worth. Trust this process. The 2020 collective bargaining agreement was intended to be the first concrete step toward making that promise tangible in a structural and enforceable way. Negotiated during a period of genuine optimism about the league's trajectory, before the disruption of the pandemic fundamentally altered the financial landscape, it included the revenue-sharing clause that would become the center of this story. The provision stated that once the WNBA exceeded a preset revenue target, players would receive 50% of the surplus above that threshold, minus 30% for operating expenses. The target was anchored in 2019 revenue numbers, then compounded upward annually to account for expected growth. It was ambitious. It was designed to create a structural incentive for the league to invest in its own expansion. And it was written with the implicit belief that the league was already on an upward trajectory that would carry it past the benchmark within a reasonable number of seasons. Perhaps 2, perhaps 3, certainly not more than 5. Then 2020 arrived, and the pandemic erased those projections entirely. Recovery was gradual and uneven. The threshold kept compounding upward while the league's finances worked slowly back toward health. The door written into the contract stayed locked for 4 more consecutive years. 4 years of players pointing at a clause that existed in writing and generated nothing in practice. And then something shifted. The union leadership found out first. The league reached out through private channels, not with a press release or a public announcement, not with a moment designed for visibility, and quietly notified player leadership that in 2024, for the first time in the history of the franchise, the WNBA had generated enough revenue to trigger the revenue-sharing clause in the collective bargaining agreement. The benchmark had been crossed. The door finally had opened. The public announcement that followed was carefully and deliberately managed. The league confirmed the milestone with controlled language. It confirmed that 13 teams would receive a collective pool of $8 million to distribute among their players. It confirmed, with measured emphasis, that this was a first in league history, a genuine milestone. And then it stopped confirming things. No full revenue disclosure. No exact benchmark figure released. No year-over-year comparison offered. No explanation of how far above the threshold the league actually finished, or what the margin of clearance looked like. The message was precise and limited. We crossed the line. Here is the money. That is all. ESPN's Katie Barnes broke the specific financial mechanics publicly, pulling the details from the CBA language and union communications. Under the terms of the 2020 agreement, players would receive 50% of the shared revenue, defined specifically as the amount of revenue exceeding the predetermined threshold, minus 30% for operating expenses. The math, once you apply those sequential deductions, is what produces the $8 million figure that circulated in headlines. Which means that the surplus above the threshold, after the league covered its expense deduction, generated roughly $8 million in distributable revenue for the players. Work backwards from that number carefully and you begin to get a sense of real scale. The threshold was crossed, but it was not shattered. This was not a league suddenly operating with enormous financial comfort. This was a league that cleared the bar, meaningfully historically, but without a massive margin of excess. And that specific distinction matters enormously in the context of what comes next. Because the union is not using this $8 million figure as a quiet cause for internal celebration. They are holding it up as evidence in a live, ongoing argument. An argument about what the league is worth, what the players deserve, and why the current system is structurally inadequate even in the moment of its first ever activation. If the league generated exactly enough to trigger sharing, if the surplus was real but not vast, then what does that reveal about the ceiling of the current model? What does it say about what becomes possible if the growth pattern from 2024 continues and compounds? And most pointedly, what does it communicate about what players were leaving on the table in every single year before 2024, when the clause existed in writing but paid absolutely nothing in practice? What happened next is where the real negotiation begins. Because this announcement did not land in isolation. It landed in the center of a labor fight that was already tense, already consequential, and it immediately became the most powerful data point either side had seen in years. Here is where it gets complicated, and where the league may have fundamentally miscalculated the effect this announcement would produce once it left their control. The WNBA almost certainly expected the revenue-sharing news to function as a positive, unifying story. After 28 years of operating without a distribution, the league finally crossed the threshold. Players finally received a tangible financial recognition built directly into their labor agreement. The system, by this reading, is working. Growth is real and documented. This should naturally operate as a moment of alignment between the league and the union. Confirmation that patience was justified, that the collaborative model was correct, that patience and investment eventually produce results that everyone can celebrate together. That is not how the union processed it. The players did not celebrate this milestone. They pointed at it. They took this number, this first ever distribution after 28 years of nothing, and they held it in front of active CBA negotiations not as evidence that the existing system works, but as evidence that the system underdelivered for nearly 3 decades and is now, in its first year of activation, barely beginning the process of catching up to what players were always owed. WNBA Treasurer Brianna Turner communicated it directly in her public statements. The players are fighting for what makes sense. That phrasing is intentionally restrained and completely deliberate. What makes sense is not a threshold bonus system that activates once across nearly 30 years of professional basketball. What makes sense, from the union's perspective, is a compensation structure where players participate in league revenue from the first dollar generated, not exclusively from the surplus that clears a compounding preset benchmark. The players' formal proposal in current CBA negotiations is therefore not an incremental refinement of the existing threshold model. It is a complete restructuring of the financial relationship between athletes and league. The union is formally demanding 27.5% of total revenue, not surplus revenue above a benchmark, not net revenue after expense deductions. Total revenue, every dollar the league generates. The players want more than a quarter of the entire financial output of the business before anyone calculates thresholds, before any expense deductions are applied, before any benchmark mathematics enter the picture. To position that demand in context, NBA players currently receive roughly 51% of basketball-related income. NFL players receive approximately 48%. Major League Baseball players operate under luxury tax structures that effectively guarantee them a substantial share of total league economics. Women's basketball players in the WNBA are currently operating under a system that produced their first ever revenue-sharing distribution after 28 seasons. And even that payment came with a 30% expense deduction before the 50% split was applied. The 27.5% demand is not aggressive by professional sports standards. It is actually conservative relative to the major male leagues. But for a league whose entire negotiating history has been shaped by the argument that it cannot afford more, this demand represents a categorical shift. A claim that the league's financial trajectory has changed enough that players deserve to be compensated based on where it is going, not where it has been. The locked door opened in 2024. The players are demanding a new door entirely, one that was never built to close. When a professional athletes union publicly states that it is prepared for a work stoppage, that statement is never casual. It is never offhand. It is never a spontaneous expression of frustration from a leader who got in front of a microphone without thinking. It is calculated language released with intention, designed to be heard by a specific audience. League owners, broadcast executives, corporate sponsors, the fans who fill arenas, and the reporters who shape public perception of the negotiation. It is leverage. It is a formal signal that the union has assessed the cost of a work stoppage against the cost of accepting an inadequate contract and made a deliberate determination. The risk of the former is more acceptable than the certainty of the latter. WNBA player leadership has been using that language. And in the specific context of this league, at this specific moment in its history, it carries a weight it has never carried before. For most of the WNBA's existence, the players negotiated from a position of limited structural leverage. The league controlled the broadcast rights. The league set the salary cap. The league determined which markets had franchises, how resources were allocated across teams, and what the overall financial architecture of the business looked like. Players who wanted competitive salaries had to supplement their income by playing overseas. In Russia, Turkey, Spain, Australia, spending months of every offseason in foreign leagues just to achieve financial stability that should have been available domestically. The power dynamic was visible, consistent, and largely unchallenged for decades. Players accepted difficult deals because the alternative, walking away from the only professional women's basketball league in the United States, carried costs that were too personal and too significant to consider seriously. But 2024 changed the underlying calculus in a way that cannot be undone. Not just because of the revenue threshold crossing. Not just because of the distribution announcement. The 2024 season revealed something that the league had been operating without full acknowledgement of for years. Individual players have the capacity to move the business of this league dramatically, rapidly, and in ways that directly affect the financial metrics that determine whether thresholds get cleared. Television ratings for Indiana Fever games were not slightly elevated. They were competitive with NBA regular season numbers on the same broadcast networks. Arena attendance records were broken across multiple markets. Not just in Indiana, not just in games featuring the most prominent matchup. Teams that had spent seasons playing in half-empty buildings were turning fans away. WNBA Executive Director Terry Jackson, Treasurer Brianna Turner, and the union's broader leadership understand the weight of this moment with complete clarity, and they are not going to exchange it for incremental progress on metrics that fail to reflect the league's new financial reality. The approaching 2026 deadline creates a fixed, unavoidable pressure point with consequences for both sides. If negotiations fail to produce a deal before that season opens, a work stoppage becomes a real and actively planned for scenario, not a theoretical possibility invoked for rhetorical effect in a press statement. The players are no longer negotiating from belief. They are negotiating from evidence. And in any negotiation, evidence changes everything. Here is the part that everyone sees and very few people want to say with the full honesty it deserves. At least not in a way that holds all of its complexity at the same time. The revenue threshold was crossed in 2024. Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA in 2024. Those two facts exist in the same sentence in every serious piece of analysis about this moment, and treating them as unrelated because the connection is uncomfortable is not honest journalism. It is avoidance in service of a cleaner narrative. What Clark brought to the league in her rookie season was not incremental growth along an existing curve. It was a categorical change in the type of attention the WNBA was receiving. Her college career at Iowa had already established her as one of the most recognized athletes in the United States. Not the most recognized women's basketball player, not the most recognized college athlete, but one of the most recognizable active athletes across all of American sports. The 2024 NCAA tournament, capped by a final featuring her Iowa team, drew the largest television audience for any college basketball game in recorded history, men's or women's. The margin was not close. More people watched that game than had watched the majority of NBA playoff broadcasts during the same period. When Clark was selected first overall by the Indiana Fever, the most anticipated and covered WNBA draft pick the league had ever produced, the effect translated immediately and completely into the professional game. Indiana Fever home games became national television events with multi-week advanced sellouts. Road games in cities where the Fever had no historical fanbase were filling arenas weeks before tip-off. The league added broadcast windows it had not previously been offered by its network partners. Sponsorship deals that had been stalled in negotiations suddenly moved to completion. Merchandise, specifically jerseys, sold in volumes the WNBA had never come close to achieving. Clark's number 22 Fever jersey reportedly ranked among the top-selling jerseys across all professional sports in the United States during the 2024 season. Not all women's leagues. Not all basketball. All professional sports. Television ratings for WNBA games featuring Clark were, at multiple points during the regular season, competitive with NBA regular season broadcasts on the same cable networks. That had never happened before. Not for any game, any matchup, any player, any individual moment in the league's 27-year history before 2024. Not for Diana Taurasi in her absolute prime. Not for Lisa Leslie at her most dominant. Not for any of the founding generation's greatest performances. The league's visibility changed in the exact year Clark arrived. Here is the uncomfortable reality that analysis cannot avoid. If the WNBA's financial breakthrough was primarily driven by Clark's first season, if the threshold was cleared because of the attendance surges, the television deals, and the merchandise revenues tied to one player, what does that say about the league's structural financial health independent of her presence? The question is not meant to diminish what happened in 2024. It is meant to interrogate what 2025, 2026, and beyond look like if the growth doesn't sustain. And more pointedly, what does it say that 28 years of collective excellence didn't move the needle the way 12 months of one player's rookie season did? Here is the counter-truth. Stated plainly, without hedging, without qualification designed to soften it, because it deserves to be stated with the same directness as everything that came before it. The players who were already in this league before Caitlin Clark arrived built everything that made 2024 possible. Not most of it. Not a meaningful portion of it. Everything. The WNBA's cultural identity, its standing as a league of athletes who are full human beings with political agency, moral convictions, and a platform they have consistently used for something larger than basketball, was not assembled quickly or easily. It was constructed over decades by players who made deliberate choices to stay in a domestic league that underpaid them when they had the demonstrated ability to earn more money playing exclusively overseas. It was built by players who participated in social justice movements at moments when professional male athletes in major American sports leagues were still debating internally whether speaking publicly was appropriate for someone in their position. It was built by athletes who played through a pandemic season in a controlled bubble environment, at real personal cost and genuine sacrifice, because keeping the league visible and operational during that period mattered to them more than the alternative. Maya Moore stepped away from professional basketball at the height of her playing powers, in what should have been peak earnings seasons of a career that had already made her the best player in the world, to pursue the wrongful imprisonment case of Jonathan Irons. That decision cost her years of competitive basketball and peak career income. It also established her as one of the most respected figures in American professional sports, across any gender, any league, any era. It added something irreplaceable to the WNBA's identity as a league where athletes are treated as complete people. Breanna Stewart tore her Achilles tendon during the EuroLeague final in 2019, an injury most athletes never fully recover from at the elite level, and returned to win a WNBA championship and an MVP award. Aya Wilson became the most dominant player of her generation while operating under a salary structure that could not, by any reasonable market calculation, reflect what she was actually worth as a basketball player and a brand. These players carried this league's credibility and cultural weight through seasons when the financial model was not working, when the threshold was an abstraction, when revenue sharing was a clause that would never activate, when the only argument for staying was belief in what the league could eventually become. They did all of that without a distribution, without the leverage that documented financial growth provides, without any of the tools the current union now holds. The risk embedded in the current cultural moment is that the Caitlin Clark narrative consumes the larger story entirely. That the coverage settles into framing this as her league now, her growth metrics, her business impact, her arrival, in a way that quietly erases the foundation that was already present when she got here. Because without that foundation, there is no platform to elevate. Without the credibility built across 28 seasons of sacrifice and excellence, A talented rookie from Iowa enters an empty room. The veterans built the room. The union is making sure that fact stays in the conversation. The 2026 season is coming. That is not a metaphor. It is a calendar date that both sides of this negotiation have circled, measured the distance to, and are now actively sprinting toward from opposite directions. The CBA deadline is not hypothetical or distant. It is a fixed point in the near future, and every week that passes without a new collective bargaining agreement in place makes the possibility of a work stoppage more concrete, more discussed, and more real to the people whose decisions will determine whether it happens. Here is where every thread in this story arrives at the same place simultaneously. The league has a revenue-sharing distribution it can point to as documentation of growth. After 28 years of asking for patience, there is finally a number on paper, $8 million, league confirmed, undeniable. But the players are not celebrating that number. They are citing it as evidence for why the entire compensation model needs to be replaced before it produces a second distribution under the same inadequate terms. The union holds leverage it has never possessed before in the history of this negotiation. First ever revenue sharing, fully documented. A 2024 season that proved empirically and publicly that individual players can shift the entire financial output of this league in a single year. A leadership team willing to use the phrase strike readiness in press statements and on the record with national reporters, knowing exactly what signal that language sends to owners sitting across a negotiating table. The owners are operating in territory they have never had to navigate. The foundational argument that sustained unfavorable deals for decades, the league loses money, there is nothing to share, has been removed from the table. The 2024 season cleared the benchmark. The books produced a surplus. Whatever the full financial picture looks like behind the numbers the league is declining to release, the one-sentence argument that justified low salaries for 28 years no longer exists. And everyone in that negotiating room knows it. Sitting beneath all of this, quiet but significant, is the question of Caitlin Clark's own contract situation. She is currently operating under a rookie-scale deal that pays her a fraction of what any reasonable market assessment of her value would suggest. When her contract comes up for renewal, the question of what the WNBA salary structure is capable of offering becomes immediate and personal in a way that abstract CBA negotiations rarely produce. If the new agreement doesn't create a structure that can pay its highest-profile players at rates that reflect their actual market value, the league risks watching the exact revenue driver that proved the financial model could work seek alternatives, negotiate leverage of her own, or simply demonstrate that the system is still not built to retain what it generates. The owners understand this. The players understand this. The union is using this. With the deadline closing. With $8 million on the table as documented proof. With 27.5% of total revenue as the formal demand. With strike readiness as the stated position. With a generation of veterans refusing to allow their contribution to be reduced to backstory. Everything is in the room at once. One beat remains. Every question opened in this story deserves to close. That is what a payoff does. Not with easy resolution, but with honest reckoning. The threshold, what it was built on and why it was so difficult to reach for so long. It was constructed on 2019 revenue figures, then compounded upward with each passing year. The pandemic did not simply damage the league's finances in 2020, it caused the actual revenue to fall while the required benchmark kept climbing. For 4 years following 2020, the WNBA was not just trying to grow into a target. It was chasing a target that accelerated ahead of it annually. When 2024 arrived and compressed years of projected growth momentum into a single extraordinary season, the gap finally closed. Not comfortably, the margin was real but not vast. But enough. For the first time, enough. The timing? Why it matters that this landed in the middle of active CBA negotiations rather than after them. Because the union chose the moment of this disclosure deliberately. The league's carefully limited framing, no full revenue disclosure, no exact benchmark published, no transparent accounting, was an attempt to contain the narrative. The players' response was to expand it in every direction. To say, if we cross the line once, we can cross it again. And if we can cross it again, then we deserve a structure that no longer asks us to wait for a compounding threshold we don't control. We deserve a percentage of everything this business generates from the first dollar forward. The one detail the league hoped would be absorbed into the celebration without generating scrutiny. The fact that the system finally worked is not an argument for keeping the system. It is, paradoxically, the strongest argument against it. The players do not want a structure that activates once every nearly 30 years. They want a structure built for the league that exists right now, and the league that is clearly coming. This was never really about $8 million. It was about proof. About the end of a 28-year argument that ran on faith and patience and the goodwill of athletes who had every right to demand more and chose, season after season, to keep building anyway. The proof arrived in 2024, in a season that may or may not have been structurally inevitable, that may or may not sustain its trajectory without the conditions that produced it. The proof arrived, and the players are done negotiating without it. The reframe is this: the WNBA's financial breakthrough is not the conclusion of a long struggle. It is the opening argument in the most important fight the league has ever had. The fight about who gets credit. The fight about what the league is worth. The fight about whether the women who carried this business through decades of underpayment get to participate in the financial reality their labor created. The door opened for the first time in 2024. Every player in this league, veterans who never received a distribution, rookies who inherited more leverage than any previous generation held, is standing in that doorway now. They are not moving. And they are making it clear in labor filings and public statements and the quiet, undeniable language of first-ever proof that what comes next will be built for all of them. Not just for the ones who arrived when the money finally started moving. For the ones who kept the lights on until it did.